Hello, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Fredericks, and today we're going to talk about the origins of World War II. Now, you can't really get into World War II without talking about World War I, and that is 1914. Now, that war, horrible, but at least they cleaned it up in 1919 when they had the Paris Peace Conference. They tried to solve all the problems World War I created. They tried to create a situation where we'll never have war again. And to do that, they created the Treaty of Versailles. And of course, we know that was super successful. They basically stomped on Germany and forced them to get punished extensively. Now, a couple examples, just a couple. They made them pay for like all the damages of the war, Britain and France. So Germany basically is going to get thrown into bankruptcy and hyperinflation. Also, Germany got their land and colonies stripped, which is going to really anger them. As you can see here in I think it's yellow. I'm a little bit colorblind, but basically, land was taken by Denmark, by Poland, by the Netherlands, Belgium, et cetera, even France. Now, particularly the Polish land is going to cause some issues because that's got about 3 million Germans living there. And when Poland rules that land, Germany's going to, just waiting for their moment to get their land back. Now, Germany's going to be angry with all this punishment. And as we know, when you're angry, you want revenge. So the Treaty of Versailles is definitely going to plant the seeds for war with World War II. But Italy was also angry. Why was Italy angry? Well, the Treaty of Versailles is not going to reward them. Now, let's go back in time a little bit. Italy was originally a member of the military alliance, the Triple Alliance. They were teamed up with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, they switched sides in 1915 during World War I by the Treaty of London. Now, the Treaty of London said, hey, if you come over to our side, meaning Britain, we will, after we win the war, we'll give you a huge chunk of land on the other side of the coast, specifically from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But 4 years later, the Treaty of Versailles didn't live up to its promises and actually created, in the name of self-determination, the country of Yugoslavia. And they did not give Italy that land. Italy was mad. They switched side. They were on the winning team, yet they didn't get rewarded. Now, Japan also angry. Why were they angry with the Treaty of Versailles? Because the one thing they wanted, was the racial equality clause. They wanted that placed in the Charter of the League of Nations and also the Treaty of Versailles. Basically, Japan had been afflicted with an endless amount of racial discrimination. I mean, we're talking about lots of countries, but in this case, the United States had banned, under the Gentleman's Agreement, Japanese immigrants from coming into the country. And even in the U.S., as well as other countries, Asian Americans were segregated against, weren't allowed in white schools. We saw that in San Francisco again. So the Treaty of Versailles, Japan wanted to say, hey, the world needs to get rid of this anti-Asian prejudice, specifically anti-Japanese prejudice. But it was rejected. The racial equality clause was not put in there. It's kind of like a slap in the face. And once again, the Japanese were barred from going to the United States and other places. So Japan's angry. Also, Russia, now to be known as the Soviet Union, is going to be angry. Why are they angry? Because Russia went up against Germany on the Eastern Front during World War I. And when they attacked, they lost big time. Russia got just annihilated from Germany. So they had a treaty in 1917 called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This was after the Russian Revolution, where basically Vladimir Lenin, the new leader of Russia, says, hey, Germany, just let us out of the war. Stop battling us. Leave us alone. All that land you conquered during this war, you can keep it. But just leave us alone from now on. So Germany but what ends up happening is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk lost all that land in Eastern Europe. Russia no longer had it. But 1 year later, Germany got beat up and they lost the war. So did the Allies then give back that land to Russia? After all, Russia was their ally, had fought with them for 3 years. But under the Treaty of Versailles, they didn't do it. Instead, under self-determination, they said, all right, that land, we're going to give Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, we're going to give you all your freedom. Russia no longer can control you. Neither can Germany. So those new countries were created by the Treaty of Versailles, and Russia, Soviet Union, were super resentful. They lost more soldiers than anybody in World War I. They did so much, yet they lost big time. So Russia's fuming and angry. In 1919, you have those four major powerful countries all angry at the Treaty of Versailles and promising that someday they would undo it. So that's kind of the impact of the Treaty of Versailles, planting those seeds leading to World War II. But we got a lot more to talk about. That anger does subside a little bit in the 1920s. good economic times occur, generally the world economy is doing well and the world is happy. We bounce back from the terror of World War I. But then in 1929, as we know, the stock market crashes. It's both a symptom but also a cause of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression just starts going. Everybody gets upset. American consumers. The problem with the Great Depression is once America was deep in the Great Depression, American consumers could no longer spend all that money they had. So American banks also couldn't loan countries around the world money, particularly ones that needed it. So that US depression is going to spread into a world depression. Now, how to deal with all that poverty from the Great Depression? Well, it's going to lead to a lot of sadness and fear and anger, right? When people are experiencing sadness and fear, they want to blame somebody and they want to get their revenge upon them. And so that blame game is definitely going to create kind of a lot of anger that's going to lead to World War II. Now, where's that anger going to be directed? Really, the Treaty of Versailles and anybody who was on the winning team that made the Treaty of Versailles. So all those countries are going to want to rip up that treaty because, again, they're going to be stuck in poverty and they're going to blame the Allies for that poverty. So all those angry people ended up electing angry leaders. So that's why the Great Depression led to World War II. When you have a poor, fearful, angry group of people, they're going to elect people like Hitler in 1932, who vows to undo the Treaty of Versailles, undo the consequences of World War I, and to get what the German people deserve. So Hitler brings a bunch of angry solutions, and part of that is going to be imperialism. Not just Germany, but Italy, Japan are going to try to imperialize, if that was a word, their way out of the Great Depression. If you don't have resources, if you're struggling economically, why not conquer and take? That's one way to get what you need. So a huge theme in the 1930s is going to be imperialism. So everybody take a moment to read this. I'm going to read along with you. First, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was not one of them, so I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not Jewish, so I did not speak out. And when they came for me, there was nobody left to speak out for me. This is a quote that really, really captures the 1930s. There is going to, those Axis powers, those aggressive countries are going to just one by one undo the Treaty of Versailles, conquer other countries, and nobody's going to do anything about it. And finally, when countries do something about it, we had lost 20 to 30 to 40 countries that no longer could help out in stopping these aggressors. So really the lesson of this is you can't just worry about yourself individually. Countries of the world have to think for the future and collectively worry about the future. Because if you just let all the problems of the world just get bigger and bigger by not dealing with them, eventually you're going to get yourself into trouble. And that's what happens. So let's kind of walk through those 1930s. In 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria. Basically, they took over one of the wealthiest, resource-laden areas of China. And more specifically, when they went into Manchuria, the world completely ignored it. Now, the creation of the League of Nations by the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to lead to collective security where all the countries would stop a country like Japan from going into Manchuria. But they were distracted by the Great Depression, their own problems, and generally apathy. So they ignore, the League of Nations in the world ignore when Japan takes over Manchuria for the most part, and the bad guys notice. They're like, you know what, if they appease Japan, maybe they'll appease me. In 1935, Italy does the same thing. They invade one of the few remaining parts of Africa that was not colonized, and that would be Ethiopia. They attack, the world almost does nothing, pretty much nothing. We'll round up to nothing. They ignore it. Bad guys notice again, specifically Germany's like, wow, the League of Nations isn't doing anything about this aggression. So in 1936, what does Germany do? Germany knows everybody's distracted by the Great Depression, knows that they're all weak and in kind of an appeasing mood. Germany reoccupies the Rhineland. Now, during the Treaty of Versailles, the agreement was to protect France that Germany could not put the military or militarize this land on France's border, to the west of the Rhine River. And that was the agreement to keep France safe. But Germany then marches into it. They're like, this is my land. And what happens? Britain and France, the League of Nations, they do nothing about it. Now, historians say at this point, if the world just all stood together, if the world all said, Germany, get out or we're going to invade you, Hitler would have had to back down. He wasn't entirely militarized just yet. But the world ignored it. So, world ignores, once again, that buffer zone between France and Germany, gone. But more importantly, the lesson was learned by the aggressive nations that the world is not in the mood to do the collective good of stopping them from conquering. In 1936, Spain is going to erupt into a revolution and have a civil war between the royal government and the fascist rebels. Now, what ends up happening? Germany sends troops and planes as Air Force to help out Francisco Franco and the fascist rebels that are trying to take over Spain. Italy also does it, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party. And what happens? The world ignores the situation again, and Spain is conquered by fascists and is, some would say, a puppet of Germany and Italy, or certainly a strong ally. Francisco Franco takes over. So in 1937, Japan attacks all out China. We're not just talking about Manchuria. Japan launches a major assault into the rest of China. Japan's philosophy is basically that they are superior culturally speaking, and if they could just get China's resources, they would be unstoppable. So what does the world do when Japan launches World War II in Asia in 1937? Nothing. The world ignores it. In 1938, Germany says, you know what? I want Austria. Austria is filled with Germans. I will think the Germans should be part of Germany. So what is he marches in? This is called the Anschluss, or the joining, and basically saying that Austria is German. He himself, Hitler, was from Austria, and he wants it to be joined with Germany. But the thing is, the Treaty of Versailles said that couldn't happen, because after World War I, even though Austria was stripped from its empire now by itself, the Allies didn't want Germany to get more powerful, so it forbid in the Treaty of Versailles these two countries from joining together. Hitler marches in, most of the Austrians cheer, and now Austria is annexed. Germany is more powerful. The world completely ignores this. In 1938, Hitler has another demand. He says, give me the Sudetenland or else. Now, remember, World War II hasn't happened yet, so everybody's worst case scenario is World War II happening. Now, if you look here, here's Czechoslovakia, and around the outside of Czechoslovakia is the Sudetenland, a mountainous, resource-laden land, valuable land. Now, it was given to Czechoslovakia in the Treaty of Versailles as a barrier between it and Germany, so that it could stand up to Germany. Now, it was also meant to make Czechoslovakia more powerful with those resources, so it could stand up to Germany if it combined with Britain, France, and Poland. Now, here's the thing. That's the Sudetenland. You can see it right there, that outside part of Czechoslovakia. And Hitler says, I want it. It's got 3 million Germans there. Give me the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia should not have this. Hitler even makes the argument, if I went to war with Czechoslovakia, 3 million Germans could be conscripted into the Czechoslovakian army and fight against Germany, their actual homeland. That's not fair. I want my people back. I want my land back. So Czechoslovakia says, no, I'm not giving you the land. It ain't going to happen. Now, why is Czechoslovakia, who's definitely not as powerful as Germany, so brave? Because the Treaty of Versailles has two big brothers that have sworn to protect it, Great Britain and France. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, they said they would protect the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. So Hitler says, well, it's war then. You're not going to give it to me? We're fighting. He actually comes up with a deadline. The whole world thinks World War II is about to start. Great Britain is panicking, and now the Prime Minister of Great Britain says, I can solve this. His name is Neville Chamberlain. So he travels to Munich, which is right on the border of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, right where Hitler's invading forces are lining up. And they have a conference. It's called the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference is where Chamberlain on the left there, who's shaking Hitler's hand, hopefully they can come up with some agreement to avoid war. Now, the demand is, give me the Sudetenland or it's war. Chamberlain's like, come on, you don't want to do that, Germany. And Hitler's like, yeah, I'm going to do it like tomorrow. So Chamberlain has a choice. He can fight World War II style, which will be just as bad, if not worse, than World War I, or he can appease Hitler, give in to Hitler. Now, by appeasement, that means give somebody what they want in order to avoid conflict. Now, Neville Chamberlain had terrible memories of World War I, just like the rest of the world, and he didn't want to go back to it, certainly not over the Sudetenland. So the choice he makes is appeasement. He flies to Munich a second time and signs the Munich Pact. He's holding up that piece of paper with Hitler's signature saying, I have an agreement that Hitler will never, ever, ever threaten war again. He will never ask for more land. All he wanted in return was for the Sudetenland, so we're giving it to him. I am the greatest person ever, Neville Chamberlain. I have avoided war. I have saved the world. We are now happy. And everybody cheered. They loved this guy. Remember, in return, they got peace. And Hitler said, no more demands. Now, does appeasement work? When there's a bully and you give them your lunch money, Do they then say, all right, thank you for the lunch money, I'm not going to bother you anymore? No. When you appease a bully, that just makes them more aggressive because they realize that you're weak and that you're always going to give them what they want. So appeasement actually makes the aggressor more aggressive. So not the way we like to think of it, but that's the lesson. So the results here is the Sudetenland goes to Germany and without anybody firing a bullet. And 6 months later, Germany in 1938 takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. He goes back and breaks the Munich Pact. Now, of course, he has an excuse. When Czechoslovakia loses the Sudetenland, it throws the country to chaos. In fact, at that point, Poland, who thought that they deserved a piece of Czechoslovakia, actually sees a part of it as well. And Czechoslovakia basically had no government. It was kind of a bit into chaos. And as you can see, they're right up in the middle of Germany's land. And Hitler says, I can't have this chaos going on inside my country. I'm going to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, take control, and get rid of this chaos. Now, the rest of the world saw it as just him betraying the Munich Pact, Hitler, and taking land he wasn't supposed to have. So in 1939, Germany then comes up with his next demand, even though he promised not to. He says, give me Western Poland. Now, that's going to violate the Munich Conference, but he already did that. It also violates the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles specifically cut off a piece of Germany called the Polish Corridor, and you can see it right here. Now, Poland was created by the Treaty of Versailles because it used to be dominated by land by Germany and Russia, but we didn't want that land to go to them. So the Treaty of Versailles basically created Poland, gave them their freedom, the Polish people. But it was a landlocked country, which would mean that it was weak and therefore couldn't survive. It would get reconquered. So what the Big Four did was they cut off a piece of Germany with 3 million Germans called the Polish Corridor and gave it to Poland. That way Poland could get to the sea and trade from here. And that would make them sustainable, strong. But it really angered Germany because it's 3 million, it's a lot of land that was theirs, and it's 3 million Germans that once again were ruled by the Polish people. So, I mean, the lesson here is never take a country's land. If you do, they're going to just get so angry and just have a desire for revenge that will go unsatisfied until they start another war. So either way, at this point, Britain and France draw a line in the sand. They say, no, we gave in on the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland, the other part of Czechoslovakia. You cannot take this. We're standing up to you. Now, with Britain and France finally doing what they're supposed to, the world is happy. They're like, well, Hitler's not going to go to war with Britain and France. They're too powerful. Britain and France are like two of the most powerful countries in the history of the world. So we're not going to have war. Now, the reason for this is we all know that we should know that a huge reason why Germany, the most powerful country of Europe during World War I, lost that war because they couldn't win a two-front war. During World War I, they were surrounded by Britain and France on the west and then Russia on the other side, and they couldn't divide their armies and still win that war. So they can't win a two-front war. That was the lesson for Germany of World War I. But thank goodness now, right prior to World War II, for the Soviet Union, because basically we know that the Soviet Union is a huge country and they're going to attack Hitler from the east, and Britain and France are going to attack it from the west, and we still have a two-front war, just like World War I. That's why Hitler's not going to make good on his promise to invade Poland, because he knows he'll still have a two-front war and can't win that. But how do we know that the Soviet Union is going to be an ally of Britain and France, just like World War I? Well, Hitler's own book, Mein Kampf, talked about his greatest enemy is communists, despises Jews, and the highest concentrations of Jews in the world was Eastern Europe, including in Russia. Hitler hated Slavs, considered them one race that was beneath the Aryans. All the raw materials of Western Russia, Hitler wrote in his book Mein Kampf that the only reason they lost World War I was because they didn't have the raw materials, or Lebensraum, the land that he needed to support his industry. So it was well said that Hitler said the key is to conquer Western Russia in order to make Germany unstoppable. And finally, there was just so much war between Russia and Germany that there's just hatred there. So they are the greatest of enemies, the Soviet Union and Germany. And so we know they're not going to ally together. So therefore, we will have a two-front war. And that's why Hitler can't attack Poland, because he can't win a two-front war. So the world is like kind of happy in 1939. They know that Hitler's bluffing. We're not going to get to a war. The world is happy. But then something happens. The world gets completely shocked and surprised that the only reason we weren't having war was because Germany and the Soviet Union would never be on the same team. And then suddenly it's announced they're on the same team. In 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact gets signed between Hitler and Stalin. Basically, why? What is the agreement of the Non-Aggression Pact? That for 10 years, the Soviet Union and Germany will not fight each other. They won't. And at this point, if Hitler is free not to fight on his Eastern Front, and by Eastern Front I mean the Soviet Union, that means Hitler can go to war and attack Britain and France. He's free on his Western Front because Hitler thinks he can take Britain and France in the West. But he was just worried about that two-front war, and now he doesn't have to worry about it. Now, do keep in mind, in this context, he's not counting Poland, a relatively weaker country at the time, as a real Eastern Front. But that said, this treaty frees Hitler up to fight a war, if necessary, with Britain and France. Now, there is also a secret part of the Non-Aggression Pact, and the public part was that Germany and the Soviet Union wouldn't fight for 10 years. Now, the secret part is, in 1939, World War II will begin when Germany secretly invades the Soviet Union. A couple weeks after that Non-Aggression Pact was announced, Germany would invade from the west, Soviet Union would invade from the east, and they would both get the land back that they think they deserved, that the Treaty of Versailles and the Allies took from them in that unfair Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. So, 18 days, Poland is going to surrender after those two countries attacked. 18 days. Now, then it's going to be divided up per the secret terms of the Non-Aggression Pact. The Soviet Union is going to get the east, Germany is going to get the western part. Finally, at this point, Britain and then France declare war. They stayed true to their line in the sand. They said, Germany, if you attack Poland, we're declaring war. Now, Hitler at this point is like, please, whatever. I have a Non-Aggression Pact. I can take you guys. I'm not worried. So at this point, what happens next? Well, in 1939, the Soviet Union, after taking out Poland, attacks Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and slowly attacks Finland. Now, the Soviet Union is going to conquer Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia pretty quick. It's going to be kind of a drawn-out war against Finland. Now, the goal of the Soviet Union was to essentially conquer Eastern Europe to prevent Western Europe from ever invading it again. So the goal here of the Soviet Union of conquering Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland and Poland is to basically put a barricade there, to put soldiers there, to build up those countries as a defensive allies, like satellite countries. Now, why was Stalin so worried? Well, Napoleon invaded from the west in 1800 and killed maybe 1 million Russians. And then during World War I, the same thing happened, and Stalin's sick of the West constantly invading them and attacking and killing Russians for hundreds of years. So that's why Stalin wanted this. It wasn't that Stalin and Russia was just trying to be evil by conquering. They were trying to defend their own country. I'm not sure imperialism can ever be justified, but at least it was a rational decision, not necessarily a fair one. Now, that said, what are the British and French doing during this? Hiding, essentially hiding. They are not willing to attack Germany. Now, France in the last 20 years had built a defensive structure on their border with Germany called the Maginot Line. Now, that Maginot Line, you can see the dots here protecting it. So the Maginot Line was just endless tons of concrete and weapons in that concrete that would make it very difficult for Germany to attack France. So that's where the British soldiers and the French soldiers are lining up on the Maginot Line. Is much easier to defend than attack, so the British and French are defending themselves, waiting for Hitler to attack. Now, that totally lets Hitler heal his country and rebuild his troops after his invasion of Poland. So it would have been much better in hindsight for Britain and France to attack, gone on the offensive, but instead they respond in a weak way and just sit there defensively, letting Hitler pick the time and the choice of when he's going to invade them. So after recovering for 6 months, what does Hitler do in 1940? He avoids the Maginot Line completely. That would be the advantage that Britain and France had, and goes to the north. He attacks Denmark. Denmark surrenders in 4 hours, and then he attacks Norway. Now, Norway, the reason why Hitler went after Norway is because Hitler's theory about why Germany lost World War I was because the British blockaded Germany, and Germany wasn't able to get any resources or trade with anybody, and therefore they were starved out of the war. Now, Norway has so much coastline that Hitler was worried that the British were going to blockade him again using Norway, and the British were. They were planning on doing exactly that. And Germany wanted to beat them to it, conquer it, prevent themselves from getting blockaded in, and that's exactly what Hitler's going to do. So, 62 days, Norway surrenders. Who's next? France and Britain go after the ones that declared war on Germany. Now, do keep in mind, a lot of people say Hitler was out for world domination. It's a little bit controversial because Hitler, according to his book, thought that the key to Germany's success was Lebensraum, land to the east, to take out Russia. Now, the only reason some would say why Hitler even went west and north to conquer was because the British and French declared war on him. I suppose if he was alive, he would say, I didn't start the World War. I would have gone against the Soviet Union. You guys forced me to go west. So that's one interpretation. Either way, it's now time for Hitler to attack them. So he doesn't want to attack them directly. That's the border that you're seeing here between France and Germany, because they have the Maginot Line that gives them a defensive advantage. So what does Hitler do? Goes around it, just like Germany did in World War I. Let's not be surprised. Germany actually cuts through the Netherlands and Belgium to avoid the Maginot Line. So, boom, cuts through those countries. Now, the Germans move so quickly with some surprisingly good moves that they actually trap and surround the British and French troops that at that point had moved into Belgium and Netherlands to take on the Germans. Now, once these troops were surrounded, they're not allowed to maneuver. They get outflanked on every side. They are doomed. So this is to the point where, wow, within weeks, it looks like that two of the strongest countries in the world are done. They lasted for 4 years in World War I and won, and now in a couple of weeks, they are surrounded. Their militaries have been defeated. It doesn't look good. So at this point, 90% of their troops are trapped. They've been surrounded. The world is panicking. This war is over. Hitler, the worst person ever maybe, is now going to conquer all of Europe. Nobody's left. The Nazis have won. People are panicking. The world is like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. But Britain got rid of Neville Chamberlain, the great appeaser of the Munich Conference, and now has a new leader, more radical, stronger, a guy named Winston Churchill. And he says, I'm not going to sit down like my predecessor would have. I'm going to save those soldiers. And his idea is, we're going to do it right now. So he says, he puts out an announcement. Anybody who has a boat, I don't care how big or small, you need to bring it right now to this southern England. So they gather 850 boats as quickly as possible, and they save 338,000 troops, British and French, from the beaches of Dunkirk that were surrounded by the German troops, about to be captured. Now, this is a really big deal. If the British did not save those 300,000 to 400,000 troops, I'm not sure they could have possibly defended their island from a German invasion. But this is going to allow them to prolong the war. So here's Dunkirk. While the Germans were slowly pushing towards them, trying to capture them, the soldiers were coming out trying to get rescued and slowly getting evacuated. Here's one ship that saved all these soldiers from, getting captured by Hitler. And all those soldiers now were in Britain, and they could live to fight another day, defend the island, and slowly, it's going to take 3 years, mount a counteroffensive that we call D-Day to take back Europe. Now, this is going to be considered the miracle of Dunkirk. The war was over. Britain and France were done. Their soldiers were trapped, but they were rescued at Dunkirk thanks to Winston Churchill. The world is so unbelievably happy and celebrating. But Churchill goes on the radio and says, we must be careful not to assign victory. We didn't win this. Wars are not won by evacuations. This is a disgrace. I don't care if we can save the day for the next 3 years. No, we just lost, and we lost badly. So Dunkirk is kind of a miracle, but at the same time a disaster. The British and French troops are now left Europe. Europe is completely undefended. It's just a matter of time till Hitler gains kind of total control. Now, in 1940, at this point, Italy has stayed out of the war, even though they're allied with Germany, out of the war. They're still tired from their war in Spain, a little worn down. But at this point, Mussolini is like, I need to invade France. Why? Because France and Britain are done after Dunkirk. They're about to surrender. And the only way that I can demand spoils of war and massive amount of money and stuff is if I get in the war and a couple of my people die. The moment I have Italian people killed by the French, I can demand reparations after the war. So even though Italy completely was not ready for war, they joined the war to attack France for this reason. Now, they're going to guess wrong. The war wasn't weeks from ending. It turned out to be years from ending. So Italy definitely made a mistake, but it seemed rational at the time. So Italy attacks France. 6 weeks later, France surrenders. 6 weeks. Here's Hitler showing off that he conquered France. Now, what happens in France? Basically, Hitler's like, well, my only enemy left is Britain, so I'm going to take the outside area of France. So this will help me defend against Britain, but also invade Britain. And then I'll leave the southern part to France. France can still rule that. I won't occupy that. And what Hitler did was he took sympathetic people, like basically Nazis that lived in France, and put them in charge of France. And that's going to be known as Vichy France, named after where the new capital was. Since Hitler had conquered Paris, Vichy is the new leader of France and whatnot. So Vichy France doesn't have a good reputation. They were puppets of the Nazis for the rest of the war. In fact, the U.S. even battled the navy of Vichy France in another battle that we'll talk about later. Well, anyway, in 1940, Britain stood alone by themselves. Now they were protected because they were an island, and in order for Hitler to invade, Germany would have to travel over water, which would make them sitting ducks because you move slowly over water to the British Royal Air Force. So at this point, Hitler's like, I can't take out my last enemy until I take out the Air Force of Britain. Now this is going to be called the Battle of Britain. It's going to go on for months. Basically, Germany is going to target the airfields and airplanes of Britain. Once he takes them out, he can invade and then conquer Britain, right? So the Royal Air Force is the target, and as you can see on this map, this is where the Germans were attacking Britain daily and nightly. Now, it wasn't working. As much as Germany was attacking Britain in the Battle of Britain, Britain was not surrendering. They were not losing enough planes or airfields. They were fixing it. Under Winston Churchill's leadership, they would not give up, even though some Brits wanted to give up and make a peace with Hitler. So Hitler comes up with a new strategy, and it's called the Blitz. Now, the Blitz is part of the Battle of Britain. Instead of targeting just airplanes and runways and air bases, now Hitler says, I'm going to target cities. I'm going to kill women, children, men, grandparents. I'm going to just kill civilians. And eventually, they'll be so sad at the destruction that they will want to give up. Now, a huge historical lesson came from this, that when you hurt civilians, when you make people sad, you don't actually make them sad, you make them angry. It solidifies their resolve. So you can't take out civilians in the hopes of making people surrender. That was disproved in World War II. Now, many people in Britain were getting to the brink of wanting to surrender, contrary to what I had just said. But thankfully, they had a strong leader, particularly Winston Churchill, who went and gave a rousing speech in Parliament where he said, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. By him saying this, it made it impossible for all the people that wanted to surrender. He just ignited such passion of saying we will never surrender, such nationalism, patriotism with his speech. So in 1941, Britain's kind of mostly defeated. They haven't surrendered because of Winston Churchill, but Hitler never won the Battle of Britain. He was never able to invade, but he says, they're mostly defeated. So Hitler says, time to go after my real goal. Remember, he says, I was just distracted from my real goal when Britain and France attacked me. But that said, he says, my real goal is the Soviet Union. Now, to prepare for this, he needs to cover his southern flank, right? Your side, so your enemy can't come around you and attack you when you're not paying attention. So he goes to his flank and says, Hungary, join me or die. Hungary joins. Romania, join our team or die. And Romania joins and becomes the fifth Axis power. Then goes to Bulgaria, join me or you guys die, I'm going to invade you. And Bulgaria is like, I'll join the Axis power. So now they're a team of 6, right? Italy, Germany, Japan, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Now, Yugoslavia says, I'm not joining you. And in 10 days, Yugoslavia gets invaded and surrenders. Greece is a little more complicated. They surrender in a couple of weeks, but they keep fighting a little bit. And now Hitler has totally conquered his flank. Now, at the same time, in 1940, Italy starts trying to launch their empire, and they attack North Africa. Specifically, they move to the east from Algeria, which they owned, and attack Egypt, because Egypt is where the British are. And the British are there to protect the Suez Canal in Egypt is the gateway to all the Middle East and Europe, which is invaluable, right? Everybody needs oil. So in 1941, at this point, Hitler's like, I can now attack the Soviet Union. So he attacks the Soviet Union, his ally, breaking the non-aggression pact. The Soviet Union was so unprepared. They signed the non-aggression pact so that they wouldn't have to worry about Germany. And here comes Germany. They were so not prepared. The Soviet Union gets absolutely crushed. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, basically a 3-pronged strike towards Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the central areas of the Soviet Union, and Stalingrad to the south. Stalingrad was famous for protecting the oil of the Soviet Union. And Hitler just conquers 1,000 miles right away, just crushing the retreating Soviets. Now, in 1941, the world is at the most miserable stage it's ever been, according to some opinion. The Nazis have dominated Europe. Britain has been crushed, and Italy is reigning supreme in North Africa. And that is the peak of the Axis powers, because something happens that changes the course of the war, and that's Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, pulling the U.S. in the war. And of course, Hitler is partners with Japan and declares war in the U.S. once Pearl Harbor gets struck, and the U.S. is pulled into both the European and Pacific theaters. And that means the Axis powers days are numbered and whatnot. But that will be another story that we continue on. Thank you. You look for your hopefully this has been helpful in your understanding of the origins of World War II for the U.S. and look for your assignment in Google Classroom.